Undercover police smash a global paedophile ring which watched children being abused live on the net. Is it a sign of success in combating online predators or of just how bad things have become? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Sami Zaidan. It took more than a year and spanned 35 countries, the biggest ever criminal investigation of its kind. Well, at the end of it all, police smashed a global network of paedophiles. Well, yes, authorities, you may say, may have shut them down before, but this ring seems to have reached new limits. Chat participants watched children being abused, even raped, live on the internet. Well, detectives in the inquiry say they've rescued 31 children, most of them in Britain. 700 suspects have also been identified. The ringleader is Timothy Cox. Cox ran an international network from nowhere else other than his bedroom in England. He had more than 75,000 indecent images on his computer alone. Well, the abuse involved babies as young as 2 months. And Cox called his site "Kids, the Light of Our Lives." Well, he's not seeing much of the light of day now. He's been jailed indefinitely. More than 100 other people have faced court in countries ranging from Australia to Canada. So what shape did the inquiry take and just how difficult was it? Well, in March 2005, investigators in Canada unearthed an online paedophile chat room. That site was taken down, but it later re-emerged in the UK. Canadian police infiltrated it and passed the information on to British investigators. Well, Timothy Cox was identified and arrested in September 2006, but undercover police kept the chat room up and running for a further 10 days. In that time, they were able to identify hundreds of members across the globe and gain vital information about its victims, while other forces were then alerted worldwide. We're joined now by our guests to discuss the issue here. In Toronto, Sergeant Paul KRAWCZYK from the Toronto Police Force. He's the officer, of course, who started the undercover investigation that smashed the ring. And in London, Michelle Elliott, a psychologist and founder of the children's charity KIDSCAPE. And joining us from Birmingham, Dennis Smith, a sex, crime and child protection consultant with RWA-CHILD Protection Services. Thanks for joining us. Perhaps I'd like to fire off a few questions first to Sergeant KRAWCZYK. How do you uncover this sort of ring? One would imagine that they probably take a fair number of security measures.
They do. We got fortunate in this case in that someone came forward, they were arrested, and they were willing to cooperate with the police, and they let us onto this chat room, which we then infiltrated. It wasn't easy. They had, bouncers or bodyguards sort of manning the room, and we had to get in there, take one of them out, and then assume their identity.
All right, despite the fact that they may have bouncers, they were doing things like broadcasting live rape sessions. How do you get away with something like that, something as abhorrent as that, for so long on the internet?
Well, you know what happens is this is their life. I mean, and we found in this chat room in particular, people were abusing children specifically for the purpose of obtaining more child pornography, not even to get their sexual gratification, but just to get greater status in the room. As hard as that is to believe, children were being victimized for that purpose. But what happens if nobody comes forward and we can't find the site? It's very difficult for us to locate something like this. And that's why they continue to move on.
We'll talk more later on about the psychological twist there, but let's talk a little bit about the kids. How did they get hold of such a number of children as young as a couple of months, according to some reports?
Well, what people have to realize is, we talk to our kids about not talking to strangers, but in over 75% of cases where there's child abuse, it's someone close to the family or a family member. And although I can't speak specifically for each case in this investigation, the majority of these cases, it was a family member or someone close.
Well, catching them may be one challenge, but how easy is it after that to get a conviction?
Well, I mean, of course, that comes down to what country you're in. I know here in Canada, it takes a lot of forensic work on the computers, and a lot of resources go into that. And here in Canada, typically, it could be 2 or 3 years down the road after a lot of money spent in police work before the case is concluded, and that costs a lot of money.
Costs a lot of money. The fact that though 35 countries or law enforcement agencies from 35 countries worked on this investigation, is that a sign that law enforcement and authorities around the world are actually starting to cooperate more in combating this sort of problem?
Yes, absolutely. It was really great. This investigation worked really well, and you know what? We get to know each other around the world, and I can pick up the phone and phone almost any country and know somebody there, and know that when I hang up the phone, they're going to go. The fastest we had was within an hour and a half of hanging up the phone, somebody was under arrest. That's unheard of. A lot of times in policing, it's hard to deal with the police agency that's right next door to you, let alone across the world. And we're doing a really good job of joining hands and doing these together.
All right, I'd like to bring in Michelle Elliott from London. You've worked with the victims of, or some of the victims of this sort of thing. Tell us a little bit about the psychology here, or a psychologist, and what Sergeant KRAWCZYK was mentioning earlier. People get involved in this not even for personal gratification, but to impress others in the chat room. Is that typical for this sort of situation?
Well, it's not just sexual gratification anyway. There's a power element involved, and it becomes almost a macho thing with some of these people. And I'd actually like to congratulate the sergeant, because what brilliant work he's done to bring these people to book. And that means there'll be fewer victims that people like us will have to work with.
All right, if I could bring in Dennis Smith. It does sound, not to put down all the valuable work that was conducted by the police, but it does sound like the police got a little bit lucky in this regard. Is there any way to extrapolate from this whether the police are winning the battle against online paedophiles?
I mean, clearly, I want to echo Michelle's remarks. I think Jim Gamble and his team, and of course their international colleagues, have done some terrific work to pull off these arrests and the convictions that have happened with Timothy Cox and others. I mean, it's just amazing how the sort of hierarchy that exists in these rings, because we know, don't we, from even after Timothy Cox's arrest, there was another person who came in and continued to run that. Unfortunately, the police were monitoring that. To continue, rather than just rely on luck, the sort of cooperation that Sergeant KRAWCZYK has just described is of vital importance, and I'm sure if that continues, then we won't just be relying on a lucky break in future.
And how important, if I could go back to Sergeant KRAWCZYK, how important is technology, and how much at the same time is it a challenge or an enemy for the police? Because it can be used by both sides, can't it?
Yes, it can. And, you know, I'd say 5 years ago, we were about 10 steps behind, especially when it came to technology. But we've come a long way. At least here in Toronto, we've received some funding. And, you know, I went back to the offices the other day and looked around and realized how far we've come. I'd say, you know, we're always going to be playing a little bit of catch up, about one step behind, because we're obviously constrained by budgets and the law. But we are certainly a lot closer today in terms of technology and intelligence than we were, I'd say, even 5 years ago.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the point of law there. Of course, the internet is a global tool. How does that make your job a little more difficult when you're dealing with many agencies around the world with their own laws?
It makes it very difficult. I mean, typically, you know, even if we wanted to talk to an agency in the U.S., we typically have to go through Ottawa, and then that goes through Washington and back over to whoever we're dealing with. But we're lucky in these types of investigations, because there's children at risk, that usually gets expedited, and usually we're going straight to the agency with you know, the other agency's blessing.
If I could turn to Michelle once again. Looking at some of the details that emerged in this case, the ringleader had over 75,000 indecent images on his computer alone. What does that say about the number of children who are falling victims to these sorts of rings?
Well, each of those images, of course, is a child who's been abused. We don't know how many children were repeatedly abused so that somebody could look at them for pleasure or for profit or for power. But it does say that this is unfortunately the tip of the iceberg. When this kid, because he was only 28, could get away with that in a small village under the very noses of his very respectable mother and father, and all those children were abused because of what he was doing, It really is quite amazing, and we'll be talking about this sort of story again, because the kind of work that has uncovered this particular case will be ongoing. These people are very crafty. They'll set up somewhere else. Believe me, they're out there in their hundreds of thousands.
Dennis Smith, looking at those sorts of numbers of people and countries involved, are you surprised at all?
Not altogether surprised. I'd agree with what Michelle's saying, that I recall some of my earlier work with the police going back into the late 90s, where a particular forensic police officer who examined computers with the technology available in those days talked about the hair is now out of the box and we'll never get it back in again. Clearly Jim Campbell and his international colleagues proved that wrong, that we are beginning to make some strides about getting that hair back into the box. But I'm not surprised at the number of images, because if we cast our mind back to, say, the year 2000, when the Wonderland Club was exposed and sentenced, they had 120,000 images of children. The paedophiles themselves are constantly searching not only for prestige within their own organisations, but of course the Wonderland Club, to enable you to join, you had to produce 10,000 images of children almost as a joining fee. The awful business of that. So clearly I'm not altogether surprised about the enormity or the numbers of people involved.
Right, so clearly a lot of work to be done, but it is now time for a short break. When we come back, we'll ask whether police, parents or service providers can do more to make the net cleaner. Stay with us.